take of the Lord's Supper and think about Jesus as Daniel 2.0. So in John 5, Jesus makes an astounding statement. In verse 39, John 5:39, he's speaking to the Pharisees and he says, "You search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. It is these that testify about me." You remember those magic eye pictures? It's this highly detailed, colorful, eye-catching image with patterns in it. And if you look at those pictures in just the right way, you'll see this 3D image jump off the page at you. And Jesus is saying the Old Testament is like a magic eye picture. There's a hidden 3D image of Him hidden within those pages. And if you will look at it in just the right way, Jesus will just jump off the page of the Old Testament Scriptures at you. Now, some people, though, like the Pharisees, can just stare and stare at those pictures and not see that hidden image at all. And the key to getting that 3D image to jump off the page is to relax your eyes and to look through the picture. You can't just focus on the surface of the picture or you will never see it. And this was really the Pharisees' problem in reading the Old Testament, because they're reading the verses and they're seeing it all just on a superficial level. So they're reading about the animal sacrifices and Joseph's brothers, betraying him. But they couldn't see how those things applied to the Messiah and especially to Jesus. What they needed to do was relax their eyes and look through those stories, underneath the surface, in order to find Jesus. And one of my goals as a preacher is to help us learn this skill, to help us develop the skill to relax our eyes and look through the surface level details of the Old Testament so that the hidden 3D image of Christ will just jump off the page at us. And so this morning, I want us to walk through the story of Daniel, but with relaxed eyes, so that we can see how Jesus is like a new Daniel, a Daniel 2.0. But if our eyes are not relaxed, we'll miss Jesus, because we'll just be looking too superficially and we'll be making one-to-one comparisons and we'll say, well, Jesus, he wasn't taken to Babylon, and Jesus, he wasn't thrown in the lion's den, and he never interpreted the dreams of a king. So how is he like Daniel? Okay, but if we will relax our eyes and look through the surface of the story, we will see Daniel foreshadowing Jesus and how Jesus is the greater Daniel. And it'll give us a greater appreciation, and really this will be sort of my main focal point for the Lord's Supper. We'll have a greater appreciation of God's deliverance from death as we partake of the Lord's Supper. So I actually want us to start in Matthew 27. Look in Matthew 27. I want to start toward the end of Jesus' story in Matthew 27, verses 65 and 66. At this point, Jesus has been crucified and his body has been put in a tomb. And it says in Matthew 27, verses 65 and 66, Pilate said to them, "You have a guard," verse 65, "Go, make it as secure as you know how." And as they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. So imagine you're reading this for the first time. Jesus has just been crucified. He has just been buried, and now the tomb is covered by a stone with a rope hung across it. And that rope is meant to keep this Roman seal, this imperial seal in place. And the idea is, if you break that seal, you're dead. So he's making this tomb so secure, and we're all wondering, is this the end for Jesus? I mean, it sure looks like it. But we'll come back at the end where we began to find out what happens with Jesus. But let's now go to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, let's look in verses 3 and 4 to start. Daniel 1, verses 3 and 4. And this is the Babylonian palace. This is the king of Babylon. It says verse 3, "The king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths," verse 4, "in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans." The Chaldeans is another way of saying the Babylonians. So Daniel and his friends were taken captive to Babylon to serve in the palace of King Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. And now if you read with your eyes too focused on the surface, too rigid, you'll say, hey, Daniel is good looking, but Jesus was not. Well, that's fair. But let's relax our eyes a bit, okay, and look at this beneath the surface. Let's take a more general look at what's happening. If you think about it, Daniel, he was taken from his home to live in a completely foreign land, and it was not his fault. Daniel was a righteous man. Yet he was taken into captivity because of the sins of the people around him. So here is an innocent man suffering for the sins of the nation. Now we're starting to see maybe some of that 3D image coming into view here of Jesus. Now, while in Babylon, he learns their ways and their culture and their language so he can speak to them on their level. He was a Jew, but he put on Babylonian flesh, if you will, so to speak. Yet notice, Daniel, he maintains this perfect balance of living like a Babylonian, but also keeping himself free from sin. And his very first temptation involves food. So in verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, and he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. So Daniel sees their Gentile cuisine as defiled in some way, and he refuses to eat all that delicious food. Again, kind of sounds like Jesus, how he came and put on human flesh to live like a human. And his very first temptation involved food in the wilderness, tempted by the ruler of this world, Satan. Now, it didn't take long before the Babylonians realized there is something different and special about Daniel. When King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, he brings his magicians in and he tells them, I don't just want you to tell me the interpretation of the dream, I want you to tell me what the dream was. Everybody was eager to tell them the interpretation, if only he would tell them what the dream was. And he says, no, I'm going to really challenge you here. You got to tell me what the dream was. And listen to their response. Look in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. The Chaldeans answered the king, verse 10, and said, there is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. So they recognize, okay, there's no one on earth that can do what you're asking. The only ones that can do this are gods. But the thing is, here's the problem. They say, but gods don't dwell in mortal flesh. And then in steps Daniel, who wasn't actually a god in the flesh, of course. But you see Daniel doing what they thought only a god in the flesh could do. And because of Daniel's supernatural abilities, his reputation and his influence grew in Babylon. Even when there's a new king on the throne, look over in chapter 5 now. There's a new king on the throne. This is Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar. Belshazzar says this to Daniel in Daniel 5 in verse 14. Daniel 5 in verse 14, he says, now I have heard about you. So all of Babylon is talking about Daniel. He says, I've heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination and insight and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. So he's so wise. The Babylonians are all talking about him. And then notice verse 29. After he interprets Belshazzar's dream, verse 29, then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple. And they put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. So to summarize so far, here is an innocent man who suffered exile for the sins of his people, who kept himself holy, who distinguished himself as someone with supernatural wisdom, almost like he is a god in the flesh. And now he's being hailed and exalted as a king. 3D image of Jesus coming more sharply into focus. But let's continue. Because when the Persians take over the Babylonians, now there's a new king, the Persian king Darius. And even he recognizes there is something extraordinary about Daniel. And so he continued to exalt Daniel and to give him high status. But here's the turning point in the story. The Persians in the ruling class are jealous of Daniel. Because here's this foreigner, and he's somehow being exalted in a place of rulership over us. And so they plot to kill him. And now we're in Daniel 6. Daniel 6, verses 3 through 5. Verse 3, then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. And then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. And then these men said, we'll not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him in regard to the law of his God. So here they're trying, right? They're trying to accuse Daniel. They can't do it. They keep coming up short because Daniel is too righteous. And so now they have a new plan. And they say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have the king sign an irreversible decree that anybody who prays to anybody except the king of Persia for the next 30 days will be killed. And they did this. And you know why they had to do it this way? I mean, they said it, like the only way we're going to bust him is in regard to God, getting him to compromise his faith. But think about it this way. The reason why they knew this would work is that they knew that Daniel was a faithful man who would choose to do his Father's will over his own. They knew Daniel was not a person who would say, oh, wait, they're going to kill me? I guess I'm not going to pray then in order to save his own life and do his own will. They knew Daniel was a man who would do the Father's will, even if it meant death for him. And so Daniel did his Father's will, and he prayed 3 times a day, like he always did, and was arrested for it. Kind of sounds like Jesus on his knees in the garden, praying 3 times before his arrest. And King Darius is absolutely distraught over this. Look in verse 14. Look in verse 14. Then, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed, and he set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue Daniel. The king knew that Daniel was innocent, and he didn't deserve this. If he were Pilate, he might have said, I find no guilt in this man. But the king's hand was forced because under Persian law, not even the king could reverse a decree made by the king. And so, verses 16 and 17, then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. This is essentially Daniel's tomb. A stone is rolled over it with a royal seal to secure it. And the question on everybody's mind, again, especially if you're reading this for the first time, is, would God forsake Daniel and turn him over to this gruesome death? Would he allow evil and injustice to win over his righteous servant? And we get the answer at dawn in verse 19. The king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near to the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. And the king spoke to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? And then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I have been found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. And then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him because he had trusted in his God. In the end, God wins here. He defeated all of Satan and his allies' attempts to conquer his righteous servant. And now, not only is Daniel spared from death, But the very evil forces that put Daniel there in the first place, they met their deaths because of it. And so in verse 24, the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them and their children and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So Daniel's bones, like the bones of Jesus, were spared from being broken and crushed. And now notice, because of this great deliverance from death, God is glorified and hailed now as the true king. Look in verse 25 to 28. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples and nations and men of every language who were living in the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And so this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So think about it this way. After Daniel's death and resurrection, now the good news of the gospel is hailed throughout the whole earth to all nations, that God's kingdom is everlasting because he has the power over death itself. Now go back to Matthew 28. Matthew 28. We left at the start with that seal set on the stone over the tomb. And now we'll end here in Matthew 28, verses 1 and 2. Now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave, and behold, a severe earthquake had occurred. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. Drop down to verse 5 and 6. The angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he was laying. Notice, it's dawn again. And this time, it's not the king of Persia who rolls the stone away. It's the king of the universe, right? It's the king of heaven sends an angel. And like Daniel, Jesus was alive because he trusted in his God and did his Father's will. He too was taken up out of the tomb, and now he's ready for the good news of the gospel to be spread to all nations. That's what he tells his disciples. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth, and now I want you to go and tell everybody about my everlasting kingdom, because Jesus wants the world to know they can overcome death too, because of what he has accomplished. Now, Jesus isn't exactly like Daniel. He's Daniel 2.0. He wasn't exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon, but from heaven to earth. He didn't just adopt our culture, he put on our flesh. He wasn't just mostly righteous, he was perfectly righteous. He didn't just have the Spirit of God in him, he was actually God in the flesh. And unlike Daniel, Jesus actually was killed by his enemies. Interesting, in Psalm 22, which is all about Jesus, Jesus quotes it on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Later in that psalm, Jesus says, my enemies have opened their mouths wide like roaring lions. And later, Peter, he calls Satan a roaring lion. So Jesus was thrown to the lions too. But unlike Daniel, he actually was devoured by them. Jesus actually was killed by those lions, yet that still wasn't enough to keep him from breaking the seal on that stone and being taken up from the tomb in victory. And as we partake of the Lord's Supper, let's just rejoice that there is no hope like this in the world, that we serve a king who can reverse death for his faithful servants, that we worship in a kingdom that cannot be ended by death, because death is only the beginning for his servants. We, like Daniel and like Jesus, we may feel like exiles in this world, and we may feel fear from our enemies and even the fear of death. But the Lord's Supper reminds us that no matter how dark things get, behind the sealed stone that has been rolled upon us by the world, dawn is coming. And we will reign with our risen Lord forever in his everlasting kingdom. Let's remember that while we partake.